Hey guys, it's Mount Walk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about a top 10 list. And of course, this one's going to be top 10 really crappy cards to play against. So these are going to encompass all sorts of different categories, like think really nasty stacks pieces, or even just like cards that promote really boring games, or just like really overpowered cards, stuff like that. So a whole range of really unfun cards to play against. And some of it's my own bias. I actually got one card on here that most people probably haven't played against, but is definitely has given me PTSD, I'm pretty sure. Um, so, yeah, gonna be a lot of different stuff. A lot of stuff I didn't put on here because there's just so many other cards you could put on here. I mean, obviously things like Hymn to Turok, right? Like that's a pretty obnoxious card to play against. I didn't put on Strip Mine, Mental Misstep. There's a bunch of stuff. I mean, it'd probably be too hard to really make a list of probably the trying to sort of quantify objectively, like, okay, what is what and what's the best. Um, just so many really unfun cards. Most of them from the early days of the game, but not all of them. Not all of them. So, yeah, let's get to it. With that being said, let's start this super sweet top 10 list. All right, starting off strong, we have one of the possibly one of the most obnoxious cards to play against, Stasis. With this card in play, you're never winning fast, and you're never losing fast. I mean, and it's the same for both players. It's like just slows the game down to a glacial pace, and basically nothing happens. If you're lucky, they'll find their stasis or excuse me, their black vice to go with their stasis, or their morphling or chronotog or something like that to go with it to actually kill you at some point. But a lot of times it's like it's hard to tell. Like, will they be able to keep their stasis up? Will they find a Forsaken City? Will they have enough gushes and dazes and thwarts and so on, force of wills or whatever to keep it going? Who knows? But you got to keep playing anyways, because they could just crap out. So yeah, that's one of the worst parts of stasis is like it keeps tricking you into playing because you think you could win possibly. Yeah, so that's not not the most fun play experience. So yeah, there you go. The only reason this isn't like, I would say like, oh, the most crappiest card to play against ever, even though it is, its reputation precedes it, is very difficult to build around. It's very hard to keep up. You're probably this card. I can't imagine you ever playing this card in a tournament and actually winning, just because like timed rounds and everything else. Like, it's not gonna be happening, right? You can't ever really kill very quickly. Um, so yeah, Stasis is definitely a relic of a bygone era, a much older time in Magic. Hasn't been very good in at least 2+ decades, but you can play it in formats like old school. I think you can with like Howling Mind, that kind of works, and in Kismet too, or you can play it as well in pre-modern, where you can have like Black Vice and stuff like that too. Um, it's a little slow, obviously. There's a lot of rebs and things like that, so it's not quite as good as you would think, but it is a legitimate deck in pre-modern, especially when you're just playing for fun, playing the fun tournaments or whatever, where maybe super hardcore time stuff is not an issue. But anyways, so yeah, not that scary anymore. Definitely a much older card for a much older era, but still deserves a slot on this list for being really boring. Man, it's boring, but I still like it anyways. All right, and now I have the most least favorite card. I don't know what that means, but I hate this card. I have lost to it so many times, like in the Heartbeat of Spring decks or the Tron decks from back in Extended. Those things were just never fun. Moment's Peace just it was just so yeah, it definitely is a very deflating experience to play against this card. You cast it once, then they flash it back, and then if they cast another one, because they always have another one, and it's just like, why did I even play? Why did I even play? You know, definitely always made me want to pack like 8 Flaring Pains in my sideboard or something. Um, but yeah, Moment's Peace definitely a pretty not fun card to play against. It looks really innocuous. It's actually super miserable. Doesn't see a lot of play in most places anymore because it's just not legal in anything like modern or newer. And that's probably for the best. This card is really, really, really not fun to play against. I mean, they even make fogs like 2 mana these days. They don't even make 1 mana fogs because of like turbo fog decks. So yeah, fog effects can be actually pretty annoying. Think of like the constant mists, the buyback fog. Yeah, that one's pretty brutal too. Same sort of thing, but Moment's Peace asks less. It's just asks for mana. And it's like, oh, 2 fogs in one. Oh, and now here's my tooth and nail for my stupid combo thing, and I kill you. Like, that's fun. Anyways, so yeah, there you go. Moment's Peace. Everyone's favorite fog. Okay, now we got Smokestack. This is definitely one that was a lot spookier in formats like Vintage, especially back in the day where you saw a lot more prison style decks. This is a pretty spooky card once it gets set up, but it's not too hard to break it up with artifact destruction and things like that. Hurkyl's Recall, all that kind of stuff. But once it gets going, like a Smokestack on 1 or 2, and you're down to like, only a few permanents or whatever, I mean, it's going to be really hard to break out. So, in that respect, yeah, it is pretty spooky, pretty unfun to play against. And the deck will just end up killing you with like a Goblin Welder over 20 turns. It's happened a bunch. I've seen it. So yeah, it's one that's easy to break up, but it is a really strong hard lock once you get it going. Once you rev up those smokestacks, get your tangle wires and spheres and things like that. And you'll pretty much inevitably, since the stacks decks typically were usually or almost always all permanents, you didn't really ever have the chance of like people having more permanents than you typically. So yeah, Smokestack definitely a really strong one. A lot better back in the day. Saw a little bit of play in Legacy 2 and the Armageddon stacks. Sees a little bit of play in pre-modern. Just not much play it sees today. But that's okay. That's okay. But definitely a pretty unfun one I've lost to quite a few times. So yeah, there you go. All right, and now we have Humility. This card is crappy for a couple reasons. First, well, it's on the reserve list, so anything that's on the reserve list, just terrible. Absolutely terrible. Second, the rules with this card and layers, if you're like a newer player and an experienced player, you don't know all the rules, it's going to be real frustrating, going to be tough to deal with. That's not fun. And third, just the effect is just brutal. I mean, it's just so brutal. Again, the only saving grace for something like this is that it's uh, uh, well, it's 4 mana, right? 4 mana, double white is a pretty big ask, even for a card that's like this big of a bomb. Can be hard to support, hard to play. Again, in older formats, we see play. It even saw play in Legacy, I think, in like in the Landstill decks, but that was quite some time ago. And I think maybe even the Miracle decks played it from time to time, like a copy. It's very good. It's very strong. Shuts down all creature stuff, turns them all into 1/1, so it shrinks them more often than not. So that's really great. So yeah, this card is frustrating to play against on like a lot of different levels. Just think of like the interactions with manlands, where like a Mishra's Factory becomes a 2/2, not a 1/1, because it's in a different layer, but it does lose the tap ability. So yeah, definitely stuff that's not intuitive or obvious. So yeah, Humility, definitely one that's pretty frustrating to play against. A little slow for these days, but that's okay. Less frustrating cards is typically a better play experience for everyone. But again, I still like it. I like all these cards, even if they are frustrating. All right, and the card that I don't think anyone really likes, I'm pretty sure, is Oko. So this one is just blanks. Just completely takes off all the text of your artifacts or creatures, if they're supposed to be relevant, if they're big creatures. Yeah, this guy, I'll turn him into elk. They don't do anything. And it just becomes a creature if it is an artifact. So that's even another thing that can hurt. So yeah, this thing does a lot. It makes a ton of extra cardboard with the food tokens and stuff. It can buff your life total by sacking the food tokens. It has a silly amount of loyalty for a 3-mana planeswalker. It can steal your opponent's stuff by exchanging it for an elk, you know. So or just a food token or something. This thing just does everything. And talk about repetitive play patterns. It's really not fun. It's about one of the least fun cards that's been printed in the last couple years. I think this is probably the sort of Skull Clamp level mistake that is just like absolutely miserable. Well, actually, Skull Clamp was really fun to play with, but it was all over the place. It was very ubiquitous. You had to be playing Skull Clamp decks because that's the only way to keep up with the other Skull Clamp decks. And that was sort of the way it was with Oko, being able to create your own elks and turn off all your opponent's stuff and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, this card really made combat really obnoxious. It made games really boring. It turned off your deck. It like basically you didn't work if your creatures did cool things or your artifacts did cool things. Now they do nothing. So yeah, there you go, Oko. I guess I don't really have to say too much about this guy. He's pretty obnoxious. He looks really smug, so I guess that makes sense. Yeah, not fun. Alright, and now we have a sort of different kind of obnoxious planeswalker. Whereas Oko played a lot to the board and messed with that, Teferi screws with the stack, which in some cases makes people even more upset. You know, people want to play their stuff at instant speed and things like that, and of course Teferi shuts all that down for your opponent, but lets you do it so you can play like, you know, draw step, thought seizes, or end of turn ponders, stuff like that. Pretty powerful. Obviously the plus, yeah, it gives you the instant speed stuff. The minus is like some sort of super repeal, which is pretty sweet. And of course the passive is just, yeah, it shuts off not only like any sort of stack stuff, like stack interaction, makes them play at sorcery speed, it also turns off things like Cascade, right? This is something we see a lot in Modern. So yeah, this card's pretty obnoxious to play against, but it's not like the worst card of all time because it is still like a little bit kind of small ball. It's a little bit easier to interact with. It doesn't have a horrendous amount of loyalty. It's just hard to kill and get parity with it. Obviously, you can kill it with like little creatures pretty easily, especially if they minus it. So that's not that big of a deal. But it is so super unfun in the control mirrors where someone has a Teferi and you don't have like an ending to kill it after they play it or like a counter for it. You're just drawing a bunch of blanks. So yeah, very brutal there, very brutal there. So yeah, not a super fun card to play against, but certainly one of the more reasonable ones on this list. Probably the most reasonable, I'd say. Well, maybe I guess. Yeah, probably this guy, I guess. Yeah. All right, and something that isn't really reasonable at all, Winter Orb. Yeah, this card is obviously you can play it in stacks style decks, since it doesn't affect like artifact mana. So obviously, if you had a bunch of Moxen or something, that kind of stuff, or you can tap it to turn it off. That's kind of interesting. But typically, where we'll see this normally these days, at least outside of like the commander sphere, we see it in like Delver style decks as a way to beat up on control decks, play a couple copies of Winter Orb, and it's really great against those decks because they're very mana heavy and mana hungry, right? So they want to play a bunch of expensive spells, play a bunch of spells, and this really punishes them for having that super high curve. So this is one of the ways you can sort of get extra points against those like Bant control decks, the 4-color control decks, that sort of stuff. And yeah, very sweet. Definitely not a card we'll ever see in Modern. I think this thing is just way too powerful and pumps up the aggro control deck, so like Shadow or Murktide or whatever. Just too hard to deal with. Even with something like Prismatic Ending, or even like Disenchant Effects, Beseiju, whatever. I think this card is just too unfun, and it asks nothing of you other than just like only playing like a 1 and 2 mana cards. Other than that, like it won't affect you at all, and it just grinds your opponent to a halt. Yeah, very powerful card. Definitely one of my favorites. I love playing it. The Grow decks played it back in the day because it got good synergy with like Gush and Daze and stuff like that. So pretty sweet. All right, and now we have Tinker. This is on here because it is horrendously overpowered. And this is super crappy to play against because it makes games super anticlimactic. Whether it's Blightsteel, Sphinx of the Steel Wind, Bolus's Citadel, either part of the Vault Key combo. I mean, any number of things. Just you can even get stuff like Pithing Needle, I guess, in an emergency. Tinker just does it all, and like you just accrue so much advantage from casting this card that it's just unbelievable. Unbelievable. I mean, it's one of the most unbelievably powerful cards in the game, one of the best cards in the game. Um, yeah, I mean, what more can you say about this thing? It's just too good uh, in a format where there's a bunch of artifacts and there's good stuff to tutor out, which is basically every format. So yeah, not super fun, not super fair. Definitely a card I loved casting. But in here, in this slot, we could put other things like Yawgmoth's Will, Balance, Underworld Breach, although Breach you have to build around it a little bit more, but yeah. So it's just one card combos basically that just sort of like ask you to play the game or play cards you already want to play, like artifacts in the case of like vintage decks, right? Let me tell you about Moxen. You ever hear about these card called Moxen? They're pretty good. They're pretty good. So Tinker's super easy to enable. Um, yeah, so any super easy to play, super busted, powerful kind of stuff. Yeah, that would go in here. I guess you could even say something like Thassa's Oracle, although you obviously do have to build around it, and it's a little more difficult. Using Doomsday or Demonic Consultation or whatever. But yeah, so Tinker, not fun in some respects, but also kind of fun in some ways. Well, fun for me. All right. Now this one hasn't aged very well, but this one was super unfun back in the day. Still very good in places like Commander, of course, but Mana Drain is basically like a Dark Ritual stapled onto a counterspell. And yeah, it's even better these days, or at least just in general, just because the removal of mana burn, although that wasn't a huge issue previously, before M10. But yeah, this thing is just, you try and play your spell, try and do a thing, and then the blue deck just counters it. Sometimes even on turn one, after like an island and a sapphire. Poof, so brutal. This thing is just absolutely not fun. Sometimes you can, if you counter their force with it, that's pretty brutal. Yeah, I mean this thing is pretty not fun these days, or well, back in the day I should say, because these days there's a ton of stuff that like just can avoid counter magic, isn't really vulnerable to it, more one mana spells, that kind of thing, and you can't really like there's not um, a lot of stuff you really want to ramp into. It's just a completely different format than than the old ones that where mana drain saw a ton of play. You know, so yeah, mana drain, pretty sweet, pretty strong back in the day. Not that scary anymore, but is definitely pretty crappy to play against because it was like I had all the unfun of like, okay, my 3-drop gets countered or my 4-mana creature or something gets countered, and they do some ridiculous thing, like they play a bunch of stuff and then Time Twister and then play some more stuff, and it's like, oh gosh. So yeah, Mana Drain, not fun, pretty ridiculous. Fortunately, a little less scary today. Still banned in Legacy, but hey, maybe we'll get it at some point. That would be sweet. All right, so here we go. Time walk plus time warp plus time stretch plus Alrund's epiphany plus nexus plus blah 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 blah. All of these things. Basically, these take an extra turn spells. Clearly, time walk is horrendously broken. Even though it's the one that's more context dependent, you know, but still, like, this is not a reasonable mana cost for a card that gives you an extra turn. So yeah, the problem with these cards is they're extremely hard to interact with, and things like Time Warp and all of its friends, when they actually start seeing play in formats like, say, Standard, or say something like Modern, or I guess older formats like Extended or something like that, typically that means they're like good enough to like you'll just win the game after you play them, because 5 mana is a pretty big investment. But if it's worth it, then it's just like, okay, I just do my thing and then I time walk and then or time warp, I should say, and then, oh, I just win next turn. Like, that's really not fun. It's, like I said, outside of, you know, counter magic or maybe hitting it with a discard spell. Really not that great. Really not that great. Not a lot of ways to combat these, and that's really not fun. I think actually maybe the worst place is in Commander, where things like Time Stretch and Expropriate can take you a lot of extra turns, and they just end up like making the rest of the table wait. But I think after you loop Time Stretch once or twice, or people see that you can, you know, you can recur it like a few more times, like they'll be like, okay, we're good. Um, yeah, not fun. Well, I mean, it is fun in some ways, but it's pretty boring. And the fact that there's no counterplay, there's like only a couple cards, like Stranglehold and I think one or other, Ugin's Nexus, is that it? That stop people from taking extra turns, but I mean, it's like two cards like in the entire game, so that's not that interesting. But yeah, really not that fun. I guess you could also, this kind of stuff also makes me think about stuff like Mindslaver, which is also pretty unfun in some respects. But Mindslaver was like it's just a one-time thing, and it was 10 mana. It got pretty annoying when you could recur it with Welder, but that was only really in Legacy for the most, or excuse me, Vintage for the most part. But yeah, this is the last one of the most annoying ones. Time walks, time warps, all these extra turn spells. Again, you can see it even in Standard today, because the power of permanents, just creatures and planeswalkers and just things that stay in play, artifacts, enchantments, all this stuff, has gone up so much that taking an extra turn with this stuff in play is worth significantly more these days for that 5 mana than back in the day. Or I should say 6 or 7 or whatever they want to price them at. So yeah, definitely not fun, and maybe they should start thinking about possibly not printing these cards, or at least in standard legal sets, maybe, or maybe just being more careful about it, because you know we see them cause a lot of issues over and over again, and like I said, just no counterplay. So yeah, outside of counter magic, and I guess sometimes discard, but yeah, so there you go. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. That was a very short, quick, very small sort of look at some of the crappiest cards to play against. I mean, there's just so many I could have listed. I could have listed big bombas, you know, things like people casting Obliterate just to troll people in Commander. That's not super fun. Um, or people casting like, oh gosh, like Grip of Chaos in Commander. That's okay, that's really funny, but it's it's not fun to like get out dice and start rolling and numbering all the different permanents and stuff for like if you're targeting stuff. Oh boy, yeah, that's a huge pain. So there's all sorts of really crappy, unfun stuff. Just sort of depends on what you're measuring, what you're looking for, and what really annoys you. A lot of people are annoyed by different things, you know. Me, I don't really care for the most part, you know. Um, so yeah, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you had fun. Hope it taught you something. Hope you hope you have a nice day. So thanks for stopping by, guys, and have a great day.